In part 1, we focused in on the standard argument for animal experimentation and evaluated it from a moral perspective, particularly with an emphasis on the principle of autonomy. In this part, we will continue to evaluate the case for animal experimentation from a moral perspective, but we'll focus in on the principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, all of which involve harms and benefits and their distribution. Therefore, to evaluate animal experimentation based on these principles, we also need to look at the scientific data on the effectiveness of animal experimentation. We need to know what sorts of benefits and harms actually exist. Before digging into the scientific evidence regarding the effectiveness of animal experimentation, let's review the 3 principles at issue here and think generally about how they apply in research. The principle of beneficence obligates researchers to protect the well-being of their research subjects by maximizing the potential benefits and minimizing the potential harms. Importantly, though, unlike the case of medical practice, in research, the harms and benefits being evaluated are wide, incorporating the harms and benefits to society at large as well as the research subjects. Put simply, the appeal to benefit argument discussed in part 1 takes a stand on this principle, that in fact the benefits outweigh the harms when all are added up. The principle of non-maleficence is of course closely related, and it obligates researchers not to harm subjects without justification. Some of the researchers in the unnecessary fuss videos may be blamed for failing on this count, and harming the apes for no good reason, like making them dance for the cameras or doing a procedure improperly that resulted in more pain than necessary. However, non-maleficence doesn't mean you can't ever harm. It does say that you need to have a good justification if you do inflict harm. Finally, and most importantly for our evaluation, is the principle of justice. This is most important because while beneficence and non-maleficence tell us to maximize benefits and minimize harms, justice tells us also to distribute those benefits and harms fairly. So for instance, it shouldn't be the case that one group of people bear all of the harms from the research but receive no benefit, while another group receives all the benefit without any of the harm. Unfortunately, it looks like we are failing miserably on that count with animal research, since the animals bear all of the burdens while the humans get all of the benefits. Justice also requires us not to exploit vulnerable populations, such as the cognitively disabled, just because it would be easier to use them as research subjects. Again, on this count it looks like animal experimentation is quite unethical, as we make use of beings that really cannot say no, since we can capture them, cage them, and tie them down with impunity. To start applying these principles in more detail, though, let's start with a human case. So let's say we want to do some psychological research on the effects of maternal deprivation on infants. Well, one way to test this would be to take 20 infants from their mothers soon after birth and raise them in isolation, so they have no maternal contact. What conclusion would we draw? Well, that maternal deprivation really sucks. Or, as an actual psychologist put it, the evidence has been reviewed, it is submitted that evidence is now such that it leaves no room for doubt regarding the general proposition that the prolonged deprivation of the young child of maternal care may have grave and far-reaching effects on his character and so on the whole of his future life. So how can we evaluate this study? Well, let's first assume that it was in fact useful. For instance, it taught us that in the case of orphan children, we should ensure there is a replacement maternal figure to give such children a better chance at life. Thus, we could say millions of orphan children from here on out will benefit from this research. But certainly there was harm involved. The 20 children used in the experiment are irreparably harmed for life, as there is no going back on the deprivation of their mothers. So one thing to say about this research is that maybe it was justified because the benefits greatly outweighed the harms. But you may also think that the research was unethical. And then the question is why? There are 2 good reasons to think this research is unethical, or at least 2 good reasons, both dealing with the principle of justice. For one, the research unfairly distributed burdens and benefits. While it may be true that many more children benefited or will benefit from the research than were harmed by it, the test subjects were all and only harmed, while it is others, who are not part of the research, who will reap all of the benefits. Thus, the principle of justice may here be violated. And secondly, You may think that ripping infants away from their mothers is a violation of justice because it is doing research on a vulnerable population. It is not like infants can really say no or fight back in any meaningful way. Moreover, as beings with no or diminished autonomy, we have an obligation due to the principle of respect for persons to protect these children. But you may think all of that was thrown out the window when we use these children for research in this way. So at least for these reasons, we are likely justified in concluding that the research was unethical. And this sort of research did in fact happen, although it was usually done with children who were orphaned for other reasons, as opposed to making children into orphans. But does your opinion of the study change when I tell you that the exact study I described has gone on over 250 times in the United States on monkeys and apes? And you are partly responsible for such studies because many of them are and continue to be funded by the federal government with your tax dollars. So all of the same arguments we just applied to the human case apply here as well, and effectively apply in nearly every case of biomedical research on animals. Animals are almost never the beneficiaries of the research they are subjected to, nor are they ever really treated as beings deserving protection due to their limited autonomy. We could say humans have rights, but the apes and monkeys do not. But as we saw in part 1, that may not work well. We could say that humans need their mothers, but the apes and monkeys do not, but that is simply false. The maternal deprivation studies that have been done on apes and monkeys do show that being deprived of a mother really sucks for them too. Even worse, some of the research involved getting baby monkeys attached to cloth monkey surrogates, only to turn those cloth monkeys into monsters to induce severe depression in the baby monkeys. Certainly this study, and paralleling it with the same sort of study in humans, was aimed at getting you to have a particular sort of reaction. It is hard, I think, in this case to say the research should be done. But of course, you may think that not all research is like this, but that depends on what aspects you're focusing on. The justice concerns we raised to the human experiment apply, but maybe the sorts of benefits to be garnered due to other research are much greater, or the harms involved to the subjects is much less than in other research. If that were true, would it make the research permissible? The principles of justice and respect for persons would still be violated, but of course it may be okay to violate a principle or even two principles, in certain cases if the other principles are maintained and are more important. So this gets us into evaluating the efficacy of animal research. Recall that the standard argument for animal experimentation included the claim that animal research reaps great benefits, that therefore the pain and suffering and use of non-human animals is justified. But is this true? Certainly drugs and therapies have become available to humans after being tested on animals, and those drugs and therapies have been helpful. But the question is whether the animal experimentation itself was essential or even useful in bringing those drugs and therapies to humans, or whether the drugs and therapies came to humans and were useful despite the fact that they were tested on animals. Historically, the scientific opinion, as argued by Cohen, is that animal experimentation has certainly led to great benefits for humans. However, that scientific opinion is starting to change. As you should have read in the topic prompt for this week, just over a month ago, a former director of the National Institutes of Health released his report that included the comment that animal experimentation has in fact been ineffective. As he put it, we all drink the Kool-Aid on animal experimentation because they can't sue us, but unfortunately it's failed and we need to move on. Here are just some examples of these failures. Dozens of treatments for spinal cord injuries have worked for animals, but none for humans. Similarly, over 100 drugs for strokes worked in animals, but none in humans. Over 85 vaccines for HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, cause of AIDS, worked in non-human primates, but none have worked in humans. And many drugs have come to market after proving safe in animal and human testing, only to cause great harm and eventually be pulled from the market, or at least relabeled with new side effects. These are just a few examples, but what it points to is a large body of evidence of the inefficacy of animal research. What it may show is that while sometimes animal research does aid in the process of getting an effective therapy to humans, more often than not, it is either a dead end that involves great suffering, or it actually misleads researchers and ends up harming humans as well. But of course, those heavily in favor of animal research may be able to pull out cases where it has been helpful. So then what do? We have cases in which it didn't work, and cases in which it did. Schenck and his colleagues do not just give us a long list of failures of animal experimentation. Instead, they give us an analysis of why such failures should be expected and why such failures are inherent in animal experimentation, while they're inescapable from animal experimentation. On their view, there's a deep problem involved in animal experimentation, and we just cannot escape it. For animal research to be successful, it must be the case that the animal being used is a proper model for humans. Unfortunately, no animal is a complete model for humans except other humans, and even there's differences. So, often researchers select the animal that best models whatever piece of a human the drug or therapy is intended to affect. Unfortunately, the problem is that drugs and therapies often affect a whole system, and in unpredictable ways. So even when a drug is effective on a rat heart, for instance, maybe in a human it will cause major problems in the gallbladder, which would be unknown because, of course, rats do not have gallbladders. The basic argument Schenck and his colleagues are putting forth is this. First, to accurately extrapolate results from an animal model, we must know the animal model is properly analogous to humans. That is just basic fact of scientific reasoning. But second, given the great deal of complexities involved in living systems and the great many ways humans and other animals can vary, or that individuals of the same species can vary, the only way we could know if the model is properly analogous is if we already tested the same substance on humans. But if this is so, then animal testing is a useless endeavor. It just causes great harm to the animals without any real benefit to humans, since we'd only know what effect it has or what information it's giving us after we've already done the test on humans anyway. And even worse, they argue that animal testing both directly and indirectly harms humans. It's not merely not a benefit, it's actually a harm. It does this indirectly by misleading scientists, which delays life-saving discoveries, as well as by wasting time, money, personnel, and resources that could be put to better use. It harms humans directly because the misleading results of animal testing has led to both human trials that harm those human subjects, as well as drugs or therapies coming to market that inevitably harmed many of those who used them. We can add to Schenck and colleagues' skepticism by also noting other problems inherent in research on animals. Animals in a lab setting are extraordinarily stressed out, which can greatly alter results and can never be fully controlled for. There are many diseases, or particular disease mechanisms, that apply only to humans, or only to other animals, and not to humans. In both cases, this can greatly affect the ability to properly extrapolate results from an animal model to humans. And there are facts that just can never be controlled for, as long as we use animals as models. All of this is what helps to explain the statistics on converting findings in animal research into something useful for humans. As Schenck and colleagues point out, a 1990 study found a 31% chance of prediction from animal to human for drugs and chemicals. But a 2002 study concluded that there was no statistically significant comparison. So while 31% is pretty low, that's actually possibly an overestimation compared to what other studies have found. Other studies have shown that a drug entering human trials after passing animal trials only has a 1 in 11 chance of gaining approval and coming to market. And Mike Levitt, who was a U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, admitted that 9 out of 10 experimental drugs fail testing because it is not possible to predict their effect in humans based on the animal data. So in conclusion, where does the standard argument for animal research stand? Well, it may violate the rights of animals, or at least harms them in ways that, absent overriding reason, we would probably not accept, even if you do not think animals have rights. But of course that assumes that you do think animals matter in some way. It clearly violates the bioethical principles of justice and respect for persons, but only so long as those principles can and should be applied to non-human animals as well. And it doesn't clearly produce a great benefit for anyone in terms of health or knowledge. But it does inflict a great deal of harm, particularly on the animals and perhaps on humans as well. The case does look pretty grim for justifying animal research, both ethically and scientifically. Not to mention that $12 billion a year of taxpayer money goes to fund animal research, such as those maternal deprivation studies, as well as studying the effects of crack on monkeys. The results? Crack is addictive. And that $12 billion doesn't even include all the private funding.